What if everything you've been taught about the pyramids is wrong? The Great Pyramids rise against the Egyptian sky like frozen waves of stone, immovable, ancient, and oddly silent. You've probably seen them 1,000 times, postcards, documentaries, that same sunlit angle with a camel in the foreground. But here's the thing no one likes to say out loud. For all our confident explanations, we still don't really know who built them, how they were built, or even when they were built with absolute certainty now. Don't get too comfortable yet. That story you were told in school, the one about thousands of loyal Egyptian workers sweating under the orders of a god king named Khufu, it's tidy, yes, but it has holes. And if you start tugging at those holes, the entire story begins to fray. What if Khufu wasn't the master architect at all? What if he simply claimed something that had been there long before him? Herodotus, the so-called father of history, claimed that 100,000 men worked for 20 years, hauling blocks with crude wooden sledges. You've heard that number before, haven't you? But he wrote this story more than 2,000 years after the pyramids were supposedly built. Imagine trying to describe a skyscraper in New York based only on a rumor whispered in medieval Europe. Herodotus also claimed they smeared onions and garlic on the workers' bread as rations. A curious, almost silly detail that survives in our history books more vividly than any real blueprint of construction. And still, historians are debating whether his account was anything more than a campfire tale. Even the Egyptians themselves seem strangely quiet about the whole thing. There are no detailed records of the Great Pyramid's construction. Think about that for a moment. A civilization that documented almost every loaf of bread, every tax, every royal affair, and yet silence when it comes to their greatest architectural achievement. Doesn't that strike you as odd? And it gets stranger. The so-called inventory stele found near the Sphinx casually describes Khufu as repairing a temple beside the monument, not building it, repairing, as if both the Sphinx and perhaps the pyramids themselves were already ancient by his time. Egyptian priests of later dynasties spoke of these structures with reverence, almost as if they belonged to a mythical past, a first time when gods or someone very godlike walked the earth. But before we drift too far into speculation, let's sit with this one fact. There is no direct inscription anywhere on the Great Pyramid that says Khufu built it. Not one. His name only appears in a cramped upper chamber discovered in the 1800s, scrawled in red paint, a chamber no one had entered in thousands of years, and oddly convenient for 19th century explorers desperate to prove the Egyptian origin theory. Historians are still debating whether those markings were ancient or, well, a little too fresh for comfort. And here's an odd fact to chew on while you imagine the stars. Above Giza, did you know camels weren't even used in Egypt until long after the pyramids were supposedly built? All those postcard images of camels strolling by the monuments are historically impossible. It's a tiny thing, yes, but it's a reminder that our vision of ancient Egypt is stitched together from assumptions, half-truths, and modern imagination. So, before you drift deeper into this quiet puzzle, let me ask you something directly. What time is it where you are? Are you listening in the middle of the night, your room dark except for this soft voice? Or maybe the sun is just rising where you are, and you're curling up for one more hour of rest. I love imagining that people all around the world staring into the same question as they drift off. And if you're new here, well, so, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me in the comments where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Because tonight, as you close your eyes, we're going to keep peeling back the sand, brushing away those neat little textbook answers, and wondering together, what if the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids at all? You've heard the story. Thousands of loyal Egyptians hauling massive stone blocks under the burning sun, day after day, decade after decade. It's the image history textbooks, love-organized labor camps, workers fed by the state, all united to honor their pharaoh. But have you ever wondered, where are they now? Not in the metaphorical sense literally. Where are their bones? If 100,000 people labored for 20 years, living, eating, and eventually dying near Giza, we should find sprawling graveyards. Instead, we've found only a few modest workers' cemeteries, discovered in the 1990s by archaeologists like Zahi Hawass. These graves, tightly clustered and far fewer in number than expected, belonged mostly to skilled laborers and artisans, some with healed broken bones and signs of medical care. Which is strange, isn't it? Ordinary peasants rarely received such attention in ancient Egypt. These weren't slaves, not in the Hollywood sense. Some of their skeletons showed evidence of rich diets: meat, bread, beer, luxuries uncommon for the poor. So who were they? Dedicated Egyptian citizens honoring their king, or were they something else entirely? And then there's the scale problem. A workforce large enough to construct the pyramids in just a few decades would have left behind massive trasses villages sprawling for miles. Waste pits, storage facilities, animal bones from slaughtered cattle. Yes, we've uncovered a few. Bakeries and work ramps, but not on the epic scale the official story requires. Even the most generous archaeological estimates struggle to reach Herodotus' 100,000 workers. Historians are still debating whether the pyramids were built by rotating teams of seasonal laborers or by a much smaller, highly specialized crew. But here's where it gets a little odd. Some of those workers' skeletons had fully healed fractures in their arms and legs, injuries you'd expect from people hauling giant stones. Yet they had clearly been treated with skilled medical techniques, suggesting they were valued, almost like professionals. Imagine that, in a world where peasants were disposable, these workers were patched up and sent back to work. That doesn't sound like an endless army of forced laborers. It sounds more like a guild, experts, maybe even foreigners, hired or brought in for a specific purpose. Speaking of foreigners, did you know that in ancient Egypt, Nubian archers and other outsiders were frequently hired for military campaigns? Egypt wasn't as isolated as we like to think. If they imported soldiers, why not engineers? Why not stonemasons with knowledge older than Egypt itself? And one more thing to stir into your sleepy thoughts tonight. We've never found a single depiction of the Great Pyramid's construction in Egyptian art. Temples, battles, feasts. Egyptians carved everything, but no grand murals of men hauling Khufu's masterpiece into place. Doesn't that feel deliberate, like a secret no one wanted to paint? I can almost hear you asking, maybe the artwork was lost, maybe it's buried, maybe, but remember, this is the same civilization that preserved tax receipts on scraps of limestone. They were obsessed with record keeping. Would they really forget to immortalize the construction of the largest stone structure in human history? An odd fact for you, just to break the tension. Some of the oldest discovered beer recipes in the world come from Egypt. Workers were apparently paid in beer, and some archaeologists even joked that the pyramids were built on barley and stubbornness. But even then, the amount of beer required to sustain 100,000 laborers would have been astronomical. We're talking about lakes of beer. And yet, no such brewing complexes have been found near Giza. So, let me ask you quietly, gently, just between us, if we can't find the graves, can't find the massive camps, and can't find the records, are we sure the story we've been told is the right one? Or are we brushing sand over something much stranger? Don't answer yet. Just hold that question as you drift deeper. The pyramids are still there, looming against the night sky, whispering in stone, and maybe, just maybe, the real builders are still hiding in the silence, waiting for us to listen. Picture it for a moment. Standing at the base of the Great Pyramid, you tilt your head back, and those perfectly cut limestone blocks seem to stretch into forever. But it isn't the limestone that keeps archaeologists awake at night. It's the granite blocks, some weighing over 70 tons, were somehow transported from Aswan, nearly 600 miles away. 600 miles. Imagine dragging a school bus made of solid rock across desert sand, with no wheels, no steel tools, and supposedly nothing more advanced than wooden sledges greased with water. That's the official explanation. Does it sound convincing to you? That granite in the king's chamber is especially puzzling. It isn't just big. It's cut with such precision that even now, engineers marvel at the tightness of the joints. Some surfaces are polished as smoothly as a modern countertop, almost as if machined. But the Egyptians of Khufu's time had only copper chisel soft metal compared to granite. Copper against granite is like trying to carve ice with a wooden spoon. You can do it, eventually, painfully, but not with this level of precision. And then there's diorite. Harder than granite, harder even than iron in some ways. Diorite pounders were supposedly used to shape the limestone and granite blocks. But anyone who's tried to carve diorite with another rock will tell you it's painfully slow. The time estimates balloon to absurd levels when you do the math. Honestly, oddly enough, some of the granite blocks at Giza bear circular drill marks. Spiral grooves, as if some tool rotated with consistent pressure. Historians are still debating whether this was some kind of bow drill, or if the marks are misunderstood quarry evidence. But the debate lingers because no one's been able to replicate those marks with authentic copper tools. And here's a stranger thought for you. Some of the stone doesn't even seem to belong to the same geological timeline as the pyramids. There are blocks showing weathering patterns that suggest they may have been quarried and shaped long before Khufu's dynasty, perhaps even recycled from earlier monuments. The pyramids, in this view, might not just be one construction project, but a patchwork of ancient, repurposed stones. The unfinished obelisk at Aswan is often cited as proof that Egyptians quarried giant stones. It lies cracked and abandoned, as if workers simply gave up. But take a closer look at the tool marks on that obelisk. Deep gouges carved in strange, parallel lines, not the random chipping you'd expect from hammering with stone pounders. Some researchers argue those marks look almost mechanical, and here's your odd fact for tonight. The same quarries that gave us the granite for the pyramids also supplied stone for ancient sarcophagi, so tightly fitted that modern engineers compare them to the tolerances of jet engines. One lid, recovered from the Serapeum at Saqqara, is so smooth inside it reflects light like glass. Copper chisels did that. Maybe, but if you're squinting with doubt, you're not alone. Let's pause for a soft, ironic chuckle, because there's something strangely human about all this. Ancient Egyptians may have dragged 70-ton blocks across deserts, But they also had pet baboons trained to fetch fruit and climb trees for offerings to the gods. It's almost comforting, isn't it? Number. Matter how advanced they were, they still liked a good monkey helper. But back to the stone. The question isn't just how the blocks were cut, it's how they were moved. Experimental archaeology has shown that dragging a 2-ton block over wet sand is possible, but 70 tons, over hundreds of miles, and then lifting it to the heart of a pyramid, dozens of meters above the ground. The ramps required would have been larger than the pyramid itself, and yet no such ramps have been found. Historians are still debating whether the ramps were straight, spiral, or whether they existed at all. So here's where I leave you for tonight, gently with the weight of those stones pressing against your imagination. What if those granite blocks weren't carved by copper chisels or dragged by endless lines of sweating men? What if they were already there, shaped by someone else, long before Khufu claimed them? Close your eyes for a moment and picture the silence of Giza before the pharaohs, the wind whispering over half-buried stones. Maybe the pyramids weren't a triumph of one kingdom's ambition. Maybe they were a memory, already old, already mysterious, waiting for someone to take credit. The Great Pyramid is officially dated to around 4,500 years ago, firmly placed in the reign of Pharaoh Khufu. That's what you've been told, isn't it? But what if that neat little date is wrong? What if the pyramids are far older than the textbooks allow? Look closely not at the stones themselves, but at the erosion. The Sphinx, crouching silently just east of the pyramids, has been at the center of a heated argument for decades. Geologist Robert Schoch shook the archaeological world in the 1990s when he suggested the weathering patterns on the Sphinx weren't caused by wind and sand, but by water-heavy sustained rainfall. And here's the kicker. The last time Egypt experienced that kind of rainfall was at least 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, long before the Old Kingdom. Historians are still debating whether this theory holds water. Pun intended, but the evidence gnaws at the official timeline. And it's not just the Sphinx. Some of the lower blocks on the pyramids themselves show curious weathering, deeper than what you'd expect in just a few thousand years of desert exposure. Could they have been standing, at least in some form, long before Khufu carved his name into history? Ancient Egyptians themselves seemed to believe these monuments were older than their own civilization. Priests in later dynasties referred to a mythical era called Zep Tepi, the first time when gods or divine rulers walked the earth. Was it just myth, or was it a cultural memory of something truly ancient, passed down like a bedtime story too strange to forget? And here's a quiet detail that few talk about. When the ancient Egyptians renovated temples or older monuments, they almost always carved their own names over previous inscriptions, claiming ownership. But with the Great Pyramid, nothing. Number. Lavish inscriptions. No carved reliefs of Khufu triumphantly overseeing construction. Just silence, as if even the pharaohs felt unworthy to deface something that wasn't truly theirs. An odd fact to lighten your thoughts. Did you know the ancient Egyptians were obsessed with wigs? High-ranking men and women wore elaborate, perfumed wigs even when bald, because showing natural hair was sometimes considered improper. Picture that, while someone might have been claiming to build the greatest structure on earth, they might have been adjusting an itchy wig under the blazing sun. Somehow, that feels very human. But back to the older Van old question. If the pyramids, or at least parts of them, predate the Old Kingdom, then who built them? An earlier, forgotten civilization? migrants with knowledge lost to time. Or here's a thought to carry with you as you drift closer to sleep. Did the Egyptians themselves stumble upon these structures, already ancient, and simply adopt them into their own mythos? The lack of construction records, the reverence in later writings, the strange weathering, it all whispers the same uneasy suggestion. Maybe Khufu wasn't a builder at all. Maybe he was just a curator of something far older, far stranger, and as you imagine those worn stones glowing under the setting sun, try to feel that age in your chest, like standing in the presence of something that has outlived countless human stories. Because whether we admit it or not, there's a small but growing circle of scholars quietly agreeing. The pyramids might not be as young as we want them to be. What do you think, lying there now, listening to this soft voice? Could you accept that the timeline of human history is still incomplete, with pieces buried deep beneath the sand? Or does the thought unsettle you just a little, like staring into the dark and realizing the stars above are older than you can even imagine? Don't worry, we're not done. There are still more questions waiting in the stone. Inside the Great Pyramid, silence is not just an absence of sound, it feels like a presence. The air is cool, still, and oddly heavy, as if the stone itself is listening. And yet, for all its vastness, the pyramid's interior is surprisingly empty. You might expect that a tomb built for a god-king would be filled with treasures, inscriptions, or at least some kind of ceremonial grandeur. But step into those chambers, and you're met with bare walls, narrow passages, and spaces that seem to lead nowhere. No painted hieroglyphs, no carved prayers to the gods. Just stark stone, polished smooth in some places, rough and unfinished. In others, doesn't that strike you as strange? The king's chamber, the supposed resting place of Khufu, holds only a single granite sarcophagus, lidless, unadorned, and empty. No mummy was ever found inside. In fact, no Old Kingdom pyramid has ever yielded a pharaoh's body. Historians insist the bodies were stolen by tomb robbers, but isn't it odd that thieves took every single royal mummy yet left the sarcophagi behind? Then there are the air shafts. Two narrow tunnels, one pointing toward Orion's belt, the other toward Sirius Snake upward from the king's chamber. At least, that's what modern archaeoastronomers believe. The shafts are so narrow, no human could have used them, and they don't even reach the outside of the pyramid. Ventilation shafts, say the textbooks. Star alignments, say some researchers. Historians are still debating whether these channels served a ritual purpose or were simply abandoned construction features. And what about the Queen's chamber? Its purpose is still unknown. Some think it was an alternate burial chamber, others argue it was purely symbolic. Robots sent into its own mysterious shafts revealed small stone doors with copper handles, almost like sealed compartments. For what? No one knows. When engineers drilled tiny holes to peek behind one of these doors, they found nothing, just another void. If this was truly meant to be a pharaoh's eternal home, why does it feel more like a machine than a tomb? The precision of the stonework, the oddly resonant acoustics, the way the granite blocks seem designed to bear immense pressure, it feels engineered for some other purpose, something we still don't understand. Here's an odd, almost absurd fact to lighten your thoughts. Ancient Egyptians sometimes placed tiny carved mice in tombs as offerings. They believed these miniature rodents could nibble away at evil spirits in the afterlife. Now, contrast that charming superstition with the clinical, almost mathematical perfection of the Great Pyramid's internal passages. One feels mythic and playful, the other feels deliberate, cold, almost technical, and there's still more mystery. The Great Pyramid contains at least 3 relieving chambers stacked above the king's chamber, supposedly to distribute the immense weight of stone above it. But these chambers, too, are oddly unfinished, with rough stonework and no signs of daily use. Did workers actually intend people to enter these spaces? Or were they structural byproducts of something much older, repurposed for Khufu's time? Even stranger, modern scans have revealed hidden voids inside the pyramid, large empty spaces that no one has explored yet. Could they be more chambers, collapsed tunnels, or just natural gaps in the masonry? Historians are, predictably, still debating. So, as you lie there, listening in the quiet, imagine this: a labyrinth of chambers and passages, some functional, some seemingly meaningless, all locked away in stone. And no matter how many laser scans or robotic crawlers we send inside, the pyramid keeps its secrets. What if the emptiness isn't accidental? What if it was never meant to hold the king's body at all? What if it was designed for something else entirely, something that even the Egyptians themselves didn't fully understand when they claimed it as theirs? Let that thought settle over you, soft as sand, as we move deeper into this quiet enigma. If the Great Pyramid truly was Khufu's crowning achievement, wouldn't he have shouted it to the heavens? Ancient Egyptian rulers were not exactly known for modesty. Every temple, every obelisk, every statue was covered in names, titles, and long lists of accomplishments. I built this, I conquered that, I am divine. But when you walk through the Great Pyramid, nothing. The walls are bare, smooth, almost unnervingly so. No carved reliefs, no painted hieroglyphs telling us which gods to thank, which pharaoh to praise. Not a single inscription saying, "This was built by the great Khufu," for a civilization obsessed with recording even the tiniest daily rituals. This silence feels almost deliberate. The only place where Khufu's name appears inside the pyramid is in the so-called relieving chambers above the king's chamber. Painted in red ochre, you'll find rough quarry marks supposedly left by workers, Khufu's gang, friends of Khufu. But here's the uncomfortable part. Those markings were only discovered in 1837 by Colonel Howard Vyse, a British explorer who was desperate to make a name for himself. Historians are still debating whether the markings are authentic or forged. Critics point out that Vyse had a financial incentive to find proof of Khufu's involvement. After all, his funding depended on delivering results. And some of the inscriptions use spellings of Khufu's name not consistent with his era. If those marks were faked or even just misinterpreted, then the only direct link tying Khufu to the Great Pyramid collapses like sand through your fingers. Now, compare this to other pyramids of the Old Kingdom, which are covered with the pyramid texts, dense religious writings about the afterlife. These texts are everywhere, in lesser pyramids, in tombs, carved deep into walls, but not in the Great Pyramid. Some argue that the pyramid was stripped of its inscriptions long ago, but there's no evidence of that. The walls don't show signs of erasure. They were left untouched, bare from the very beginning. And if you need one more reason to raise an eyebrow, consider this. Other pharaohs often destroyed or altered earlier inscriptions to claim monuments for themselves. Ramses II, for example, was infamous for carving his name over other kings' works. But no one touched the Great Pyramid, not once, as if there was some unspoken rule, some ancient respect or fear keeping later rulers from claiming it outright. An odd fact to shift the tone for a moment. Ancient Egyptians occasionally trained baboons to help them harvest figs. Imagine that, screaming baboons, tugging fruit from trees, running wild through temple gardens, while somewhere in the distance this silent stone giant loomed, indifferent to the chaos of daily life. But back to the silence of the stones. Why? No grand inscriptions. Was it because the Great Pyramid predated the system of hieroglyphic propaganda altogether? Or because it served a different purpose, something practical, something functional, not meant to be read or admired, only to exist? Some researchers have suggested the pyramid was never meant for humans at all, at least not in the way we think. Its precision, its alignment to true north, its acoustic properties, it feels more like a machine than a monument. A machine doesn't need to announce who built it. It just works. So as you let your eyes grow heavier, imagine yourself inside those blank chambers. No carvings, no bright colors, just the echo of your own breath against cold stone. Doesn't it feel strange that such a massive, supposedly sacred structure keeps its own story locked away? What if those missing inscriptions aren't a loss of history, but a clue that the story we've been told was never true to begin with? Imagine, for a moment, a pharaoh walking through the shadow of the Great Pyramid, staring up at it the way you might stare at an ancient cathedral. What if he wasn't its creator at all, but simply its inheritor? Egyptian history is full of examples of rulers claiming credit for things they didn't build. Pharaohs routinely took over older monuments, chiseling away the names of previous kings and replacing them with their own. Ramses II was infamous for this. His name is carved across temples he had no hand in constructing, as if history itself could be rewritten with a chisel. Could Khufu have done the same? It wouldn't be unusual. What's unusual is that he didn't even bother to carve his name prominently on the Great Pyramid. Maybe because it was already ancient, already revered to sacred, even for a god-king to tamper with. There's a curious example that often gets overlooked. The inventory stele discovered near the Sphinx. Though much later in date, it refers to Khufu as repairing a temple near the Sphinx, not building it, repairing. The language makes it sound as though these structures, possibly even the pyramids themselves, were already old, already standing long before his time. Historians are still debating whether the stele can be trusted, since it was carved in a later period. But even so, why would they write repair instead of build? And here's another strange thought. Some of the earliest temples in Egypt were themselves built on older, mysterious foundations. Archaeologists have uncovered layers beneath certain sacred sites that predate the dynasties, suggesting that the Egyptians deliberately constructed their monuments atop ancient ruins. It's almost as if they were preserving or absorbing the power of a much older past. Could the pyramids have been part of that inheritance? Structures so old that by Khufu's time they were already the stuff of legend. An odd fact to break the tension. Did you know ancient Egyptians kept pet gazelles? They even painted them on the walls of tombs, sometimes with names written beside them, like pets today. Now, picture that, a royal court where gazelles roamed palace halls, while outside, towering pyramids loomed like silent giants from another age. And yet, despite how absurd that image feels, the idea of borrowing monuments isn't absurd at all. Cultures throughout history have repurposed older structures. The Romans built their temples on Etruscan foundations. Medieval churches often rose on the ruins of pagan shrines. Even today, cities grow by reusing ancient stone for modern buildings. So why wouldn't the Egyptians do the same? Why break your back carving new granite blocks when there's already a colossal stone monument waiting for you, practically begging to be claimed. But what does it mean, then, for history? If Khufu didn't build the Great Pyramid, who did? A forgotten dynasty, a civilization older than we're willing to admit. Or maybe, just maybe, no single person or culture we know at all. Close your eyes and imagine the scene. A young Khufu standing before the pyramid for the first time, not as its architect, but as its awed admirer. The wind kicks up sand around. His feet, his priests whisper about gods and myths. And maybe, just maybe, he realizes the same thing you're realizing now. That he isn't the beginning of this story, but a footnote at the end of it. Asterisks stand at Giza on a clear night, and the stars feel almost close enough to touch. That isn't by accident. The Great Pyramids aren't just placed randomly on the desert floor. They seem to be aligned with the heavens themselves. The 3 pyramids of Giza mirror the 3 stars of Orion's, belt so closely that even seasoned astronomers have raised an eyebrow. The smallest pyramid is slightly offset, just like the faintest star Mintaka. Was this intentional? Historians are still debating whether the alignment was symbolic, functional, or simply coincidental, but the precision is hard to ignore. The ancient Egyptians worshipped Osiris, the god of the afterlife, who was associated with Orion. The idea goes that the pharaoh's soul, after death, would ascend to join Osiris among the stars. A comforting story, yes, but here's the catch. The alignment fits Orion's belt, more accurately as it appeared around 10,500 BCE, not 2,500 BCE, when Khufu supposedly built the Great Pyramid. This has fueled whispers that the pyramids might be far older than mainstream history allows, constructed during a time when Orion's belt matched the layout perfectly. A coincidence? Maybe, or maybe the builders, whoever they were, aligned their masterpiece to the sky as it looked thousands of years before. Khufu's reign, and then there's the cardinal alignment. The Great Pyramid is oriented almost perfectly to true north, deviating by only a fraction of a degree. Even with modern technology, that level of precision is impressive. How did they do it with no compasses, no advanced tools, just wooden sighting rods and maybe some string? Theories abound: tracking, circumpolar stars, using shadows cast by the sun. But no one has fully replicated the method with ancient tools to the same level of perfection. An odd fact for you: ancient Egyptians believed the Milky Way was a celestial reflection of the Nile. They called it the winding waterway, and some myths claimed that gods traveled along it in golden boats. Imagine lying under that sky, the same stars above the pyramids, and thinking of the galaxy as a cosmic river connecting this world to the afterlife. And if that image isn't strange enough, think about this. The shafts inside the Great Pyramid, those narrow, mysterious channels we mentioned earlier, line with stars as well. One points to Orion's belt, the other to Sirius. If it were just a tomb, why go to such trouble to align hidden shafts with specific stars? Some researchers believe the pyramid functioned as part of an elaborate star map, a terrestrial echo of the heavens. Others argue it was part of an ancient calendar, marking solstices and equinoxes with staggering accuracy. But here's where it gets quietly unsettling. The pyramids were built as a star map. For whom were they built? The ancient Egyptians, who supposedly constructed them, or someone far older, who understood the sky in ways we're only beginning to rediscover? Close your eyes for a moment and picture this: the builders standing in the cool desert night, measuring the stars with nothing but their eyes, somehow locking massive stone blocks to the patterns above. A civilization obsessed with eternity, looking to the heavens, not for beauty, but for instruction. And now, here you are, thousands of years later, lying in the dark, staring at your own ceiling, while imagining the same constellations they once worshipped. Strange, isn't it, how the stars haven't changed, but our understanding of who built under them might have. What if the pyramids aren't just monuments, they're messages, written in stone for the stars to read? Copper chisels, wooden sledges, ropes, that's what we're told built the pyramids. Simple tools, simple methods, and a lot of human determination. But stand in front of those polished granite blocks, run your fingers along the razor edges, and you can't help but ask, really, just copper chisels? Granite is harder than copper. Diorite is even harder. Yet the sarcophagi in places like the Great Pyramid's King's Chamber or the Serapeum at Saqqara are carved from massive blocks of granite, with surfaces so flat they rival modern machine tools. Some corners are sharper than the edge of a credit card, and the interior of those stone boxes is polished to a mirror-like sheen. Try replicating that with a copper chisel and a stone pounder. It's possible, maybe, but it would take an absurd amount of time, and the consistency would be almost impossible. And then there are the drill marks. Spiral grooves cut into granite cores suggest a tool that rotated with steady pressure, more like a modern drill than anything Copper Age workers could manage. Experimental archaeologists have tried to recreate these grooves with bow drills, sand, and patience, but their results look nothing like the perfect spirals found in ancient cores. Historians are still debating whether the marks were caused by simple tools, or if we're looking at evidence of a lost technique, something more advanced that didn't survive history. Some theories suggest the ancient Egyptians used pounding stones and endless manpower, but if that's true, why do we see such uniformity? Why do some blocks appear to have been cut as if they were soft, almost poured into shape? That leads to the fringe but intriguing hypothesis that some pyramid stones weren't carved at all, but cast formed from an ancient type of concrete. Geopolymer scientists have argued that certain limestone blocks contain chemical compositions closer to reconstituted stone than natural quarry cuts. If true, the builders might have been early masters of a technology we didn't rediscover until modern times. And then there's the question of movement. A 70-ton granite block doesn't just glide into place. Some experimental reconstructions involve sledges dragged over wet sand, but lifting those blocks dozens of meters high would have required ramps bigger than the pyramids themselves. No remains of such massive ramps have ever been found. Some researchers argue that internal ramps or counterweights could explain it, but no one agrees. The debate is still open, with each theory feeling just slightly too convenient. Odd fact for you: ancient Egyptians believed that rubbing onions on sore muscles relieved pain, and workers were supposedly paid in onions and beer. Picture it: someone carving near-perfect granite boxes with copper chisels all day, then rubbing onions on their arms at night. Somehow, that doesn't quite fit, does it? The strangeness doesn't stop with tools. Some ancient texts describe vibrations used to move objects, though these are often dismissed as myths or poetic language. And yet, standing inside the Great Pyramid, people report unusual acoustic property stones that seem to resonate unnaturally in the granite chambers. Could it be accidental? Or is it possible the builders understood sound and vibration in ways we've forgotten? No, this isn't the place for wild alien machine theories, but you have to admit it feels odd to dismiss the question entirely. What if they had a lost technology, something homegrown, something that didn't survive the fall of their civilization? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sound of those tools, whatever they were echoing in the dark. Not the scraping of copper, but something deeper, rhythmic, almost humming, as stones too heavy to lift seem to obey some forgotten law of engineering. So, what's more unbelievable? That ancient workers did all of this with nothing but copper and grit ore. That they knew something we no longer do. The stones don't answer, of course, but maybe they're still humming, quietly, waiting for someone to listen. Asterisk the story of the pyramids. You grew up with thousands of workers dragging stone blocks in endless lines comes, largely, from one man, Herodotus, the so-called father of history. But Herodotus lived in the 5th century BCE, more than 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid was supposedly built. His account was second-hand, at best, a traveler's tale, stitched together from local gossip and temple stories. According to him, the pyramids were built by 100,000 men, replaced every 3 months, laboring for 20 years. He described ramps made of short pieces of wood, oxen dragging blocks, and workers smearing garlic and onions on their bread to stay strong. It's a vivid picture, one that stuck. School textbooks still repeat it, but here's the uncomfortable truth. Even in his own time, Egyptians likely didn't know the full story anymore. Herodotus wasn't interviewing ancient engineers. He was listening to priests who themselves might have been guessing. Historians are still debating how reliable his account really is. Some of his descriptions are outright wrong. He claimed the pyramids had underground canals filled with water and floating coffins, which we now know isn't true. But perhaps the strangest thing is that he never actually stepped inside the Great Pyramid. Everything he wrote came from hearsay, and yet his version became the official story. Why? Maybe because it was simple, human, and easy to accept. Thousands of sweaty workers building a monument for their king. That's far easier to believe than the idea of lost techniques or forgotten civilizations. But there are whispers, literal whispers, from other ancient writers. Diodorus, for example, suggested that the pyramids might predate the pharaohs entirely. Others hinted they were built not by the Egyptians, but by an earlier, more advanced people. Those voices, of course, were pushed aside, drowned out by Herodotus's authority. An odd fact, just to keep your mind wandering. Herodotus also claimed Egyptians never ate beans, because they believed beans contained the souls of the dead. Imagine that, refusing a meal because you thought you might be chewing on someone's spirit. It's funny, almost absurd, until you realize this is the same man shaping our vision of how the pyramids were built. Why do we trust him? Because he wrote confidently, because he sounded convincing. But if you peel back his words, the pyramids themselves tell a different story. No mention of Khufu inside, no evidence of ramps, no clear sign of the massive workforce he described. It makes you wonder how much of history is just the loudest voice winning. What if Herodotus wasn't describing reality at all, but retelling a myth already ancient in his time? So picture him now, sitting in a temple courtyard, scratching notes on a scroll as priests whispered their stories. Maybe they didn't know the truth either. Maybe they were guessing, just like we are now. And maybe, as the desert wind whistled outside, the pyramids stood in the distance, as silent and secretive as they are tonight, refusing to confirm or deny anything. The pyramids don't care about Herodotus, but they might care about you, listening quietly now, trying to imagine the truth buried beneath the sand. Close your eyes and imagine the Giza Plateau not as a dry, sun-baked desert, but as a place where water once flowed. It's hard to picture now, but some geological evidence suggests the Nile River may have been much closer to the pyramids thousands of years ago. Ancient canals, now buried under sand, might have stretched to the base of these colossal monuments, making it easier to transport massive stone blocks by boat rather than dragging them across land. This idea isn't entirely new. In fact, some ancient writers hinted at it. There are vague accounts of harbors near the pyramids, and archaeologists have found traces of what might be ancient river channels. But if the Nile once lapped at Giza's edge, how long ago was that? Some geologists argue that the river shifted course naturally over thousands of years, but others whisper that the canals might date back to a time before the dynastic Egyptians even settled there. Historians are still debating whether the water channels were man-made, natural, or both. If the pyramids were truly that old, their builders might have chosen the site precisely because of its proximity to the river and ancient highway that made moving 70-ton blocks plausible. But there's another layer to this watery mystery. Some erosion patterns on the Sphinx and the lower stones of the pyramids suggest long exposure to water, not just flooding, but sustained, heavy rainfall. The last time Egypt experienced that level of rainfall was during the end of the Ice Age, thousands of years before Khufu's time. This ties neatly into the older Vanal debate we brushed against earlier, but it also hints at something else. Maybe the pyramids were already ancient ruins by the time the Nile receded and the desert swallowed them in sand. And here's where things take a leap, an odd, off-topic fact that might not be so off-topic after all. The Piri race map, drawn in 1513 by a Turkish admiral, seems to show parts of Antarctica's coastline free of ice, something we didn't confirm until the 20th century. How did a Renaissance mapmaker know that? Some argue he copied much older source maps, possibly from civilizations far more advanced than we realize. What does this have to do with the pyramids? Well, if ancient mapmakers preserved knowledge of Antarctica, could they also have preserved knowledge of how to align, quarry, or transport stone on a scale we can barely comprehend today? It's a stretch, but history is full of stretches that later turned out to be true, an amusing, almost absurd fact to lighten the mood. Ancient Egyptians occasionally kept pet monkeys trained to pour wine at banquets. Imagine that, monkeys serving drinks under torchlight while, just beyond the palace walls, the pyramids stood silent, their stones whispering secrets about a time when rivers kissed their edges. If the pyramids were built or inherited by a civilization that understood the ancient Nile's shifting course, maybe they didn't just rely on brute force. Maybe they used the river as a lifeline, floating stones right up to the plateau. And if the pyramids were already there when the water receded, then the Egyptians who came later might have simply claimed them, reshaping them for their own stories. Picture it now, not the endless desert we know, but a landscape of green floodplains, boats gliding across calm waters, and the pyramids reflecting in the river like stone islands. Can you see it? A different Giza, older, wetter, quieter, and perhaps not Egyptian at all. Asterisk, beneath the shifting sands of Giza, there's more than just rock and bone. Recent ground-penetrating surveys have revealed hints of buried structures, walls, roads, and what appeared to be long-lost buildings surrounding the pyramids. Not all of them have been excavated, and many remain hidden, but what little we've uncovered raises more questions than it answers. The official story says these were worker villages, temporary settlements for the laborers who built the pyramids. Archaeologists have indeed found bakeries, storage facilities, and modest tombs. But here's the strange part. Some of these structures don't seem temporary at all. Their stone foundations suggest long-term occupation, and some date far earlier than the pyramids, possibly to a pre-dynastic era. Historians are still debating whether these settlements were built alongside the pyramids, or whether they were remnants of an older civilization that once thrived here. Some researchers believe these villages might not have been villages at all, but part of a much larger religious or ceremonial complex. The sheer size and planned layout suggest something more permanent than worker camps. Could they have been sacred cities, constructed around monuments that were already ancient? Or were they outposts built to study or worship the pyramids long after their original builders had vanished? And then there are the tunnels. Whispered rumors among local guides speak of vast networks of underground passages beneath Giza, some allegedly sealed off by authorities. Officially, most of these stories are dismissed as folklore. But early explorers, including 19th adventurers, claimed to have stumbled into underground chambers before being turned back by collapsed ceilings or government restrictions. Even today, new scanning technologies reveal voids and hollow spaces beneath the plateau that have yet to be explored. Odd fact for you, just to keep things human, ancient Egyptians loved board games. One of their favorites was Senet, a game so old that even by the time of the pyramids, it was already ancient. Imagine workers or priests sitting in the shade, lazily moving pieces on a wooden board, while somewhere nearby, hidden beneath the sand, entire lost structures waited quietly for thousands of years. One of the most intriguing recent discoveries is what appears to be a massive causeway leading to structures now buried. Its construction is so solid and deliberate that some researchers speculate it might have connected the pyramids to other monumental buildings that no longer stand above ground. Were these just functional roads, or were they part of a grander design we haven't yet pieced together? Picture the sand being swept away in your mind, revealing streets, courtyards, maybe even walls decorated with long-forgotten symbols. Imagine a bustling city of stone, its people walking between towering monuments, a city older than Egypt as we know it. What stories would those walls tell if they could speak? And here's a quiet, unsettling thought to carry with you as you drift. What if the Egyptians themselves once dug into this same sand, uncovering the ruins of a civilization they barely understood, just as we are doing now? What if the pyramids weren't built in isolation, but were the heart of a much older city, now almost completely erased? The desert keeps its secrets well, but sometimes, when the wind shifts and the dunes move, the sand whispers just loudly enough for us to wonder. The pyramids are called tombs. That's the official line, neat and simple. Pharaohs built them to rest for eternity, their souls ascending to the stars. But if that's true, where are the bodies? Not a single pharaoh's mummy has ever been discovered in any of the great pyramids. The sarcophagi, massive, perfectly carved stone boxes, are all empty. Historians explain this away with a familiar story. Grave robbers. Thieves broke in, stole the gold, and left the royal remains to decay. Convenient, isn't it? Every single royal burial robbed, every single body gone, with no trace left behind. And there's something else odd. The supposed sarcophagus in the king's chamber doesn't even fit the profile of a coffin. It's lidless, rough on the outside, and oddly too large to have been moved through the pyramid's narrow passages, which means it was placed there before the chamber was finished, or it was never meant to hold a body at all. Some researchers believe it could have been used for a completely different purpose: ceremonial, astronomical, or something more functional, almost mechanical. Compare this to other pharaohs' tombs. The later pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties are filled with inscriptions. The pyramid text spells, prayers, maps to the afterlife. But the Great Pyramid, silent. No spells, no divine instructions. If it was truly Khufu's eternal home, why leave it undecorated? And here's a strange twist. Later pyramids are actually worse. They're smaller, cruder, and some collapsed entirely. The bent pyramid at Dosha cracked under its own weight, and the Medum pyramid partially collapsed during construction. Doesn't that feel backward? You'd expect technology to improve with time, not decline. It's almost as if the Old Kingdom pharaohs were imitating something they didn't fully understand, trying and failing to copy an older, lost technique. Historians are still debating why pyramid construction declined so dramatically after the 4th dynasty. Some argue economic and political troubles, but others suspect something deeper. Maybe the knowledge wasn't theirs to begin with. Maybe they inherited it, and once that ancient knowledge faded, their attempts to replicate it fell apart literally. Odd fact, to give you a softer image, ancient Egyptians loved cats so much that entire households would shave their eyebrows in mourning when a cat died. Imagine that people weeping over their beloved pets while outside. Gigantic stone pyramids loomed, standing empty, their supposed royal occupants nowhere to be found. So here's the question that lingers in the stillness. Were these really tombs at all? Or were they something else entirely, structures later rebranded as royal burial places because no one could admit they didn't know what they were for? Picture a young pharaoh walking into the silent chambers of the Great Pyramid, staring at the massive granite box and thinking, yes, this will do. I will claim this as mine. Because why build your own when you can take credit for something already older than your own kingdom? And now, thousands of years later, we're still repeating the same convenient story because admitting we don't know might be scarier than pretending we do. Asterisk, the ancient Egyptians had a word for a time before kings, before dynasties, before even human memory. They called it Zep Tepi the first time. According to their myths, it was an age when gods, or something like gods, ruled the earth, bringing wisdom, architecture, and order before vanishing into the stars or the underworld. To modern historians, Zep Tepi is just mythology, no different than Greek tales of Zeus or Norse sagas of Odin. But here's the curious part. The Egyptians didn't speak of it as legend. They recorded it as history. Priests described it in lists, with names of divine rulers and reigns lasting thousands of years, far longer than any human could live. Were these exaggerated records, symbolic lifespans, or were they memories of something far older, past, down imperfectly until it blurred into myth? Historians are still debating whether these divine kings were symbolic ancestors or based on real figures. Lost to time, the pyramids fit neatly into this mystery. Later, Egyptians often treated them not as royal monuments, but as relics of Zep Tepi. Temples built around them sometimes refer to them as sacred gifts, not human creations. It's as if even the priests of Khufu's time believed the pyramids were already ancient when they inherited them. And here's something almost eerie. The Great Sphinx was sometimes called the guardian of Zep Tepi. Its weather-worn face, already old in the earliest dynasties, stared toward the rising sun as if watching for something or someone to return. Odd fact to soften the weight of all this. Egyptians also believed cats carried a divine spark from the goddess Bastet, and they would sometimes place gold jewelry on their feline companions. Imagine that temples filled with pampered, jewel-wearing cats prancing around as priests, whispered prayers to gods who supposedly walked the earth thousands of years earlier. But what if Zep Tepi wasn't just a story? What if the pyramids were part of that first time, built by a civilization that vanished long before recorded history began? Maybe that's why no construction records exist. Maybe that's why the techniques seem to decline over time. Perhaps the Egyptians weren't the first, they were simply the ones who remembered, however imperfectly. Picture the desert at dawn, long before pharaohs, when green fields stretched farther than sand, and builders you've never heard of shaped stone as if it were clay. People who watched the stars, not for beauty, but for instructions. People who understood the heavens as a clock marking ages, not just seasons. Maybe those were the true architects, and all that remains of them now are stones too heavy to move, and myths too strange to believe. And maybe that's why the Egyptians honored the pyramids so fiercely. Not because they made them, but because they knew on some quiet, instinctive level that they were standing in the shadow of something far greater than themselves. There's a quiet theory whispered among those who question the official story. What if the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids entirely on their own? Not aliens, not glowing saucers hovering over the desert, but human hands, foreign hands, bringing knowledge from far beyond the Nile. Ancient Egypt wasn't isolated. It traded with Nubia, Mesopotamia, and even, according to some evidence, cultures as far as the Aegean. Travelers moved along ancient trade routes long before recorded history, carrying not just goods, but ideas. So is it really impossible that master stonemasons, engineers, or scholars from older or distant civilizations passed through Egypt, leaving behind techniques the Egyptians couldn't replicate once those outsiders vanished? Some point to similarities between the pyramids and structures elsewhere in the world. The step pyramids of Mesoamerica, the truncated pyramids of China, even megalithic structures in Turkey and South America, built by different cultures, thousands of miles apart, yet sharing oddly similar construction styles. Historians insist these similarities are coincidental, a natural result of stackstone engineering. But doesn't it feel strange that so many civilizations, separated by oceans, chose almost the same form? Massive, tapering stone pyramids, their grandest monuments. Historians are still debating whether this is pure coincidence or evidence of ancient cross-cultural exchange. We don't yet understand. And here's where the speculation grows uncomfortable. Some believe refugees from a lost civilization, maybe one devastated by the floods at the end of the ice age, carried fragments of ancient knowledge to surviving cultures. Plato wrote about Atlantis, yes, but even if that story is myth, could it hide a kernel of truth? Could the first time of Egypt have been a cultural memory of these wandering survivors? An odd fact to pull you back to something tangible: ancient Egyptians loved to perfume their wigs. High-ranking officials often dripped cones of scented fat on top of their heads, which melted in the heat, releasing fragrance as they moved. Picture that: men with perfumed fat running down their faces, trying to look dignified while maybe claiming monuments built by people far older and wiser than they were. If foreign hands did help, why don't we have clearer records? Perhaps because the Egyptians, proud and divine in their own eyes, didn't want to admit outside help. Or maybe because they truly didn't understand where the knowledge came from, they inherited it. Just as they inherited the pyramids themselves, passing down techniques they couldn't explain. Imagine it now, a group of foreign builders, strange. In dress and language, standing beside Egyptians in the early dawn, gesturing to the stars as they plotted the alignment of colossal stones. The Egyptians might have watched, learned what they could, and then, after those visitors disappeared or died out, turned the monuments into their own sacred tombs, rewriting the story. And that's what might unsettle you as you lie therein. The quiet, not that the pyramids were built by some lost, otherworldly civilization, but that they might have been built by people just like us, travelers from distant lands whose names were lost, their memory erased, leaving only stone to whisper. Their story, if the Great Pyramid represents perfection, its younger siblings are cautionary tales. The later pyramids of Egypt, those built after Khufu's reign, tell a story not of progress, but of decline. And that, more than anything, should make you pause. Take the bent pyramid at Dosha. Its sides change, angle halfway up, giving it a broken, slouched appearance, as if the builders miscalculated and panicked halfway through construction. Or the Medum pyramid, which partially collapsed during or shortly after its construction, leaving a crumbling, stepped core exposed like a broken tooth. These aren't the mistakes of a civilization that just built one of the most precise monuments in human history. Historians explain this by saying techniques were evolving trial and error before they perfected the design. But that doesn't make sense chronologically. The Bent Pyramid and Medum Pyramid are officially dated as earlier attempts, yet some erosion patterns suggest they may have been built after the Great Pyramid. If that's true, it's as if the knowledge used to build the masterpiece at Giza was somehow lost. Historians are still debating whether this was due to political instability, dwindling resources, or something far stranger, the fading of knowledge, not originally Egyptian at all. It's almost as if the Great Pyramid wasn't part of the same lineage. It feels like a borrowed design, a one-time miracle no one could repeat. Later, pharaohs tried, but their pyramids were smaller, sloppier, and often reverted to stepped designs more primitive than Giza's smooth perfection. An odd, almost humorous fact to break the weight of this: some Egyptian nobles were buried with model servants carved from wood, little figurines meant to magically come to life in the afterlife and do chores for them. Imagine that: tiny enchanted butlers serving ghostly wine while outside. Entire pyramids collapsed because no one could figure out how to build them anymore. The decline of pyramid construction raises a bigger question. If the Egyptians were the original geniuses behind the Great Pyramid, why didn't they build more like it? Why did the art of precise stone cutting, astronomical alignment, and flawless engineering fade so quickly? It's almost as if they didn't fully understand what they were copying. Some researchers quietly suggest that the Egyptians might have stumbled upon something older, blueprints, techniques, maybe even partially built structures, and simply tried to mimic what they saw. When that knowledge ran out, their attempts crumbled. Literally. Picture that for a moment. The later pharaohs, standing in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, looking up at its impossible perfection and commissioning their own versions, desperate to replicate it. But their monuments buckled, their angles shifted, and eventually they abandoned the effort altogether, returning to rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings. It's as if they gave up, admitting without ever saying it out loud that they could never match the mystery of the Giza Plateau. So maybe that's the real clue hidden in plain sight. The pyramids that fell apart aren't just architectural failures, they're confessions. Scattered across Egypt are pyramids that were never finished, silent projects abandoned halfway, as if their builders suddenly stopped and walked away. They're less famous than Giza's wonders, but they might hold even more important clues. The most striking is the unfinished pyramid at Zoyet El Arian. Its massive foundation pit, with smooth, perfectly carved stone walls, suggests that work began with impressive precision. But it was abruptly abandoned, leaving only a sunken cavity and blocks scattered around like forgotten toys. Why stop when so much effort had already gone into it? Historians are still debating whether political instability, resource shortages, or even the death of a pharaoh caused these projects to be halted. But the truth feels stranger than simple economics. Some unfinished pyramids show signs that the builders were struggling, as if trying to replicate techniques they no longer fully understood. Tool marks are rougher, angles less precise, and materials cheaper. It's almost like watching a student try to copy a master's work, failing with each attempt. Then there's the northern pyramid of Zoyet El Arian, also left incomplete. Its foundation stones are enormous, almost as large as those at Giza, yet the project was mysteriously stopped, leaving behind what looks like the base of something that could have been monumental. Was this an attempt to create another great pyramid that failed before it even rose from the ground? Or was it never meant to be finished, at all some ceremonial or experimental site we misunderstand entirely? Odd fact to lighten the mood: ancient Egyptians often wore makeup made from ground malachite and galena, not just for beauty, but because they believed it protected against evil spirits. So imagine laborers pausing their stone cutting to reapply eyeliner, carefully tracing their eyes even as they struggled to copy techniques that seemed to slip further from memory with every strike of their tools. The unfinished pyramids may be more than construction failures. They may be historical fingerprints. Proof that the knowledge behind the Great Pyramid wasn't something the Egyptians developed step by step, but something they briefly possessed, then lost. Picture the workers at Zoyet El Arian, their chisels clinking against stone, looking nervously at half-laid blocks, whispering that it couldn't be done. Maybe their foreman argued, priests blamed omens, and eventually, the pharaoh abandoned the project in frustration. If the Great Pyramid was truly built by the Egyptians alone, why do we see this pattern of decline, of abrupt halts and abandoned projects? Maybe because they were never building from scratch at all. Maybe they were trying to continue a story that wasn't theirs, holding onto a thread of knowledge that frayed faster than they could weave dot. And now those unfinished pyramids sit in silence, like broken sentences in a forgotten language, waiting for someone to understand what they were trying and failing to say. The pyramids of Egypt aren't unique, not really. Travel across the world and you'll find their stone cousins rising from jungles, plains, and even mountains. Massive stepped pyramids in Mesoamerica, flat-topped pyramids in China, mysterious terraced structures in Indonesia, and even submerged pyramid-like formations off the coast of Japan. Different cultures, separated by oceans, all choosing the same basic shape. Coincidence? Historians insist it is triangular forms are simply stable for stacking stone. But doesn't it feel strange that so many civilizations reached for the same idea? The similarities go deeper than shape. Many of these pyramids share an obsession with astronomy. The pyramids of Teotihuacan in Mexico align with celestial events. The pyramids of China are oriented toward cardinal points. Even the pyramids of Sudan, less famous but far more numerous than Egypt's, mimic certain star patterns. Historians are still debating whether this is proof of cultural diffusion, shared ancient trade networks, or simply parallel development, but the idea of a global, echo-different peoples, perhaps influenced by a much older source of knowledge. Quietly, could there have been a prehistoric culture, seafaring and skilled, that spread fragments of its wisdom to far corners of the world before vanishing? Mainstream archaeology rejects this idea, but the sheer consistency of these monuments whispers otherwise an odd fact, almost ridiculous in its contrast. Ancient Egyptians sometimes used trained hyenas for hunting. Picture that hyenas dragging down gazelles, while priests at the same time carefully aligned stone blocks to Orion's belt. It's a reminder that people can be both profoundly advanced and oddly absurd at the same time. If you stand in front of the pyramids of Giza, close your eyes, and then open them in Teotihuacan, the feeling isn't that different. Both places feel heavy with purpose, as if their builders wanted more than just tombs or temples. They wanted to speak to the stars. Imagine, for a moment, a forgotten maritime culture sailing along ancient coastlines, teaching local peoples how to align monuments to the heavens. Maybe they didn't build every pyramid themselves, but they planted the seed of an idea, a memory of the first time, long before written history. What if the Egyptians were simply one branch of a much older story, one that stretches across the world, carved into stone by hands we've long since forgotten? And now, as you drift deeper into thought, picture those pyramids not as separate, isolated wonders, but as notes in the same ancient song, humming across the globe, waiting for us to finally hear the melody again. History, as we know it, isn't just about what happened, it's about what someone decided was worth remembering. And when it comes to the pyramids, the story we're told may not just be incomplete. It might have been deliberately simplified, rewritten for control. The ancient Egyptians were masters of rewriting their own past. Pharaohs routinely erased the names of predecessors, carving their own into existing monuments. Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's greatest female rulers, was almost erased entirely, her statue smashed, her name chiseled away by successors who wanted to erase her legacy. If they could do that to a living ruler, how easily could they reshape the memory of structures already standing long before their reigns? Later, priests, too, might have had reasons to adjust the story. The pyramids were powerful symbols. Telling the people that their god-kings built them reinforced the pharaoh's divine authority. Claiming ownership of something older and mysterious would have been a political act, proof that the gods favored Egypt above all others. Historians are still debating how much ancient propaganda influenced our current understanding of Egyptian history. And then came the colonial era. Early Egyptologists, often funded by European powers, had their own biases. Many wanted Egypt's achievements to fit neatly into a timeline that supported Western historical narratives. Convenient discoveries, like the red ochre markings in the Great Pyramids supposedly proving Khufu's ownership, were celebrated immediately with little skepticism. And any theory suggesting older origins saw outside influences was dismissed as superstition or fantasy, an odd, humanizing fact. Napoleon Bonaparte, during his Egyptian campaign, once had his soldiers camp inside the Great Pyramid. Legend says he spent a night alone in the king's chamber, emerging pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what he saw or felt. Whatever happened in that silent stone chamber unsettled him enough to keep it secret for the rest of his life. But even without ghost stories, there's something haunting about how the pyramid narrative has been shaped. What if the neat version we accept Khufu's workers, copper chisels, 20 years of labor isn't the truth? but simply the most convenient explanation. A story told and retold until it became fact, while the real builders, whoever they were, vanished beneath layers of politics, pride, and sand. Picture it, an ancient priest standing in front of a crowd, declaring, "The Pharaoh built this." Did he truly believe it, or was he simply repeating what he was told to say? Did later historians repeat the same story because they believed it, or because they couldn't afford to admit they didn't know? As you listen now, lying in the quiet, think about this. Maybe the real story of the pyramids isn't just lost, it was buried deliberately, not by time, but by choice. Asterisk. And now, here we are at the edge of the story, staring at stones older than kings, older than written words, maybe even older than Egypt itself. The pyramids don't answer questions. They don't care about our timelines or arguments. They just stand, silent, as they always have, whispering to anyone patient enough to listen. Maybe the Egyptians built them. Maybe they inherited them. Maybe they were part of a much older world we can only glimpse through fragments, weathered blocks. Myths of a first time, scattered echoes from other continents. We may never know for sure. And perhaps that's the point, because the pyramids aren't just monuments, they're mirrors. We see in them whatever we're ready to believe. To the priests of ancient Egypt, they proved divine kingship. To 19th century explorers, they were trophies of discovery. To you, lying there now in the soft dark, there's something else entirely, a reminder of how small we are, and how vast the past might really be. Imagine standing at the base of the Great Pyramid, alone at dawn. The desert is silent except for the whisper of wind against stone. You run your hand along the cold surface, feel the grooves carved by hands thousands of years ago, maybe more. The sun rises slowly, spilling gold across the limestone, and for just a moment you feel the weight of all those who stood there before you, wondering the same thing: who really built this, and why? An odd fact to ground you before we drift away. Ancient Egyptians sometimes buried model boats with their dead, believing they'd sail through the afterlife. Picture those tiny wooden boats, now dust in forgotten tombs, while the pyramids vast, unyielding, still stand, defying time, defying us. So what if the pyramids were never built by the Egyptians? What if they were gifts, or leftovers, or warnings from a world we've forgotten? Maybe we'll never know, but maybe that's why they still matter, because they keep asking us to wonder. And now, as you let that thought soften, close your eyes and breathe. The questions will still be there tomorrow, waiting, patient as stone. But for tonight, let them rest like the pyramids themselves, under the quiet stars. Good night.